Thanks very much, everybody, for being here. Let's start with just a round of introductions. So why don't we start with Kurt and make our way down here?
All right. Hey, everybody. My name is Kurt Opsahl. I am the Associate General Counsel for Cybersecurity and Civil Liberties Policy with the Filecoin Foundation. For many years previously, coming to this, working with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I was General Counsel, and have been working in this space for more than a year.
Hi, I'm Isaac Sheff. I'm a computer scientist. My research is mostly in distributed systems and security, and I've been doing DragonCon panels for a couple of years now.
Hi, my name is Bill Budington. I'm a senior staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been there for about 12 years, doing various work, reversing malware, and part of the Threat Lab team, which investigates some emerging threats against the public. All
right, and I'm Andrew Hirsch. I'm a professor of computer science at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where I work on programming languages, systems, and security. And I will be a moderator today. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Let's start. Maybe we're here today to talk about CALEA, this law that insists that we have backdoors on a lot of our secure software, and the fact that China has now managed to take advantage of that as of this year. Kurt, I think you told me you had a little bit of discussion of the history of this.
Yes, I'll give a little bit of the background on CALEA. That is an acronym for Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. And CALEA came about in 1994 under the Clinton administration. And it was designed to solve the problem sort of like previously when they needed to wiretap a phone. And phones were on copper wires and such. It involved like physically putting the equivalent of like alligator clip onto some phones, and then you would hear what anyone listening to that line was hearing. But systems were getting much more sophisticated, and the law enforcement, particularly the FBI, wanted to make sure that they could continue to wiretap all the phones. The Act creates an obligation for telecommunications service providers to have the capacity for law enforcement to access, and they can do it in two different ways. One, with a lower legal standard, they can get metadata. It's called a tap and trace. And that would be information about who is calling who, what time it was, information all about the call, but not the contents of the call, which can be very potent information. There's a quote attributed to a director of the NSA. I think it had, it may be apocryphal, but it was, "We kill people based on metadata." And this is true. They have that knowing who was calling who and when they did it can give a pattern of activities. And just a bit more on a personal thing, like if you know that somebody called the suicide prevention hotline while standing on the Golden Gate Bridge at 3 a.m., then you might not, you're gonna have all the information you need to know about what they talked about. So metadata is quite powerful, but also they want to get the contents, be able to listen in. And so they tell them if they come with a warrant, a Title III, that's referencing an act of Congress that allows for the circumstances under which you can get a wiretap order to listen to the contents of a message. And in that case, they would basically add somebody in as if the law enforcement was on a conference line with them and could listen live to the call. So this was had some controversies about because this was placing a mandated backdoor for easy access. There were some safeguards put in, so like the FBI couldn't like staff people inside the telecommunications headquarters. They had to send the orders over, and the telecommunications provider had to do it themselves. They had to come, with the appropriate warrants. Though some people were suspicious, and that wouldn't happen. One of the things I said, I worked for many years at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and you're all probably very familiar, so a lot of the panelists are here. So at that time, if you look at the legislative history, you might find it odd to see that EFF supported CALEA. And what happened there was a set of people at EFF who thought that because it accepted had an exception for the internet, so it was for traditional telephones and didn't mandate this for the internet, that was, the politics is the art of the possible, what is the best deal you could have, and it was a good enough compromise. And then there's another set of people at EFF who thought, no, you shouldn't compromise on this, it's a backdoor, it's a bad idea. This led to a split in the organization. So the people who were in favor of agreeing to the deal of not having the internet in exchange with support of CALEA became the Center for Democracy and Technology, another organization that works in civil liberties to this day. And the set who thought that they should oppose CALEA became the Electronic Frontier Foundation. It's coming to this very forum. So that is part of the origin story of what EFF is today, the split. And that it's split over whether to make a compromise or whether or not to make a compromise on CALEA. Later, in the early 2000s, they expanded CALEA to cover broadband and voice over IP, giving the EFF part a great "I told you so" moment. But it nevertheless, it did happen, and now CALEA is being used for broadband and voice over IP.
Yeah, so very, very influential law in the history of the EFF in particular and civil liberties in the United States in general, I think. And this controversy, I think, is really important, this idea of should we compromise, should we think about how we can have some backdoors without compromising everything, or should we take a hardline stance against it? I think it's still a very active controversy today among a lot of people, including activists, but also scientists. And I think you were going to talk a little bit about the controversy in academic computer security.
So in academic computer security, and in fact in academic security in a lot of respects, there is always a controversy between absolutists and should we provide technology that makes less than optimal policy possible. So if you are a privacy absolutist, if you believe that all phone calls should not be able to be tapped, you might want all of the telecoms to implement end-to-end encryption all over the place. And you might set that up as one option. And somewhere in the world, someone is going to propose the stupid option, which is all the phone calls have to be completely analog, and the FBI must always have headphones attached to all phone calls. And if these are the only two options on the table, the pro-compromise people would argue that as soon as the politicians are given the option to ban the secure version, they will ban the secure version, and you'll just be left with the worst version, the least secure version. And if you give the politicians a compromise that they might be happy with, you end up with a better result. So one example, not directly CALEA related, but related to searching data people keep on phones, is a Stefan Savage from CCS 2018, which was about how would you manufacture phones to best allow for lawful search of the phone with a warrant. This was at a time when, for example, Apple and Google were producing encrypted phones. There was some controversy over whether whether prosecutors could demand decryption keys from people, and a lot of things were looking like we were having this absolutist debate. Were we going to ban encryption on phones, which would be a terrible idea, or were we going to shut law enforcement entirely? In this case, while research persists into the compromise solutions, so far organizations like the EFF have been able to hold the hard line. We have good encryption standards there. With things like CALEA, maybe good compromises weren't proposed, or Maybe
Actually,
suboptimal compromises were taken.
Add something on the encryption piece. One part of CALEA, part of this compromise, was that if users encrypted their messages, there was no obligation on the telecommunication provider to decrypt it. This was, in the early 90s, so encryption was fairly rare. PGP, pretty good privacy, was going around, but that was on email, and that wasn't really covered by this. And so phone encryption really was more an unusual thing back then. But I think that later led to why they were continuing backdoor and encryption debates later, because they saw that they sort of had poorly predicted the future, or maybe made a compromise they now regretted by saying you could bring your own encryption to the telephone and for phone calls and put that into CALEA.
Yeah, I think this is a related case, but still in the 90s and the late 90s and 96, where we had DOJ versus Bernstein, right? Where that researcher was publishing an encryption standard and was prosecuted by the government for it, and EFF defended that researcher down on Bernstein, and as a result, there was a landmark ruling, where basically code in general was to be considered a form of speech and thus protected by the First Amendment, right? So that was one of the early cases where we had this ability to encrypt protected by law. And so, we combat that with CALEA, where these are unencrypted communications that are being covered, and in 96, the broadening of the law in order to then cover internet communications and not just phone line communications. At the time when the debates were going on in Congress around CALEA, the head of the FBI, a fellow named Louis Freeh, testified before Congress, and he said all these concerns about the security, that lapses that this will introduce, well, those are overblown. Don't worry about it. These are unfounded and misplaced. Lo and behold, in 2024, you had the attacks by a group called Salt Typhoon that compromised those exact systems and made all of our communications vulnerable and exfiltrated to foreign actors.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to transition, because we've talked a lot about the background here, the history, and I think that's really all important to understand how we got to this place. But today, there's active stuff happening right now involving geopolitics and cybersecurity threats, all about this law. So, Bill, can you tell us a bit about what's going on today?
Yeah, so the law, basically we have a landscape where there are a number of threat actors that are attempting to compromise the communications of Americans, and also companies' infrastructure, and a variety of kind of nomenclatures that have been assigned to them by different companies. A lot of them, Microsoft is the one that are assigning the Typhoon family of threat actors, and that's kind of where we're at, where we have these communications being really actively exfiltrated to the point where the senior administration officials have even been compromised.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, then candidate Trump was compromised last year, as was, I believe, then candidate Harris, right? Both of them were. So, at the highest levels, we're having our senior leadership be compromised by potential foreign adversaries, which is a very scary place to be from a national security standpoint.
And this is kind of like, again, look what happened. This is what happens when you introduce clear vulnerabilities into a system, which are only intended to be used by the people that the good guys, and you can't create our kind of fundamental point of security researchers when it deals with encryption is you can't create a system where you're only introducing lawful access to the good guys and not to some third-party adversary because of either a misattribution in process, or because legal process, or because of numerous factors. There's been a great paper, Keys Under Doormats paper, that was kind of going at this from a policy angle in terms of encryption, is that these systems are being demanded by governments. I mean, you have to build something that allows us access, but doesn't allow the bad guys access, and that's the paper's whole point is that that's not feasible.
So I think this might be a good time to bring in two technical things I'm going to be saying a lot this weekend, which are confidentiality and integrity. So, these are they're pretty obvious what they mean, especially confidentiality. I think we all know what it means to keep information confidential. Integrity, also, I hope pretty clear, basically is just, can I trust that this information is actually what it says it is from who it says it is, right? And these things are really, really big concerns to those of us that do computer security research. And it's tempting, and we often think of them as being what we call orthogonal, like unrelated to each other. But this isn't quite accurate. So for instance, if I say, okay, I want you to build a backdoor that only lets me in, and you can tell it to me with this key, right? That's an integrity measure. You only give me open the back door if you have this key that you can trust. But if I don't treat that key confidentially, right? I let China see it. Now that key no longer is an integrity measure that is worth using, right? So this is a big theme in a lot of computer security. I know we'll be talking about it more on some panels later in the weekend. That losing these sort of passives, these sort of tokens that let you do things, and letting them get out to the public can really destroy a lot of stuff.
Well, don't worry, as we saw in the TM signal scandal, we are clear on OPSEC.
So, Isaac, I want to bring you back in here. We talked about whether it was a good idea to compromise at all. But I guess one other question we could ask is, was this a good compromise from the academic computer security perspective?
Was CALEA a good compromise?
Yeah.
From the academic computer security perspective, I would have to go with no. At the time these things were being implemented, the interface that implementation of the law ended up demanding was not technically good. It can be shown to be vulnerable to a number of things, including, of all things, evading wiretapping by opening too many connections and overloading the number of outgoing connections to the police, so that the police can't actually listen to the outgoing connection with the real phone call on it. Just like mistakes were made.
So you're telling me that not only does this actually get our presidential candidates listened to by China, but we can't even actually reliably listen to criminals using this.
Not if they're really up to date on the research literature.
Okay, well maybe that's not too much.
Right there, China might be.
Well, that's true, yeah.
As Kurt pointed out, things like encryption were just starting to come onto the scene in 1994 when this law was being considered. We, had we had a great deal of foresight, could have planned, frankly, I think a better compromise, and I think some academicians would argue a better compromise is possible. I know Bill would argue that a hard line is the most feasible. Nevertheless, I don't think the law that was actually created was one of those. I think it was created by people who wanted to preserve an ability that existed in the past, and that might be trying to preserve something into a very different medium, and that can look very different. So, for example, given the ability to have a point-and-click interface, when the FBI was able to do these kinds of wiretaps by 2007, we had wiretaps across the U.S. in phone calls increased by, I think it was about 2/3. And we had wiretaps, quote unquote, on emails, which at that time were mostly moving unencrypted over these wires, increased by about a factor of 30-fold. because the FBI was also learning about computers. It was also learning that they could do stuff really fast and easy with these kinds of systems.
Yeah, so I know both Bill and Kurt are, I believe, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that you both are very much on the we should brook no compromise here end of this debate. Can you maybe make a bit of a case for that?
Sure. I mean, like, I'll start out with the if you build it, they will come. And by this I mean the threat actors know if you have a system that once you compromise that system, you get the rest. So the very design of this type of backdoor is to have a point at which someone has privileged access to get whatever they like. And thus you have a extraordinarily tempting target. So great resources can be spent on identifying that target.
Bribe that someone.
What?
Bribe that someone.
Yeah, you could do it with money. You could do it with like getting somebody who secretly works for you get hired by that entity. We've seen a lot of this.
Hi, I'm the password inspector. I'm here to inspect your passwords.
So
Surprisingly well, the RSA company, one of the best crypto companies in the world, had a bunch of devices compromised by somebody basically pulling that.
And a lot of, I think it was I forget if it was Bolt Typhoon, which was the infrastructure, the American infrastructure infiltrations. Were a lot of them cases were Korean actors being placed strategically hired at U.S. technology companies like Intel, I think.
Yeah. I mean, this is an ongoing issue. North Korea has a very active program to get its teams hired as remote workers, pretending to be American. There's usually an American who's a sort of a mule who, for a cut of the action, gives their social security number and whatnot to somebody else who then gets hired in their name, and they have like laptops running in their house in America, so the IP addresses work out great, and they connect back to the workers in North Korea. In some cases, they're just doing it to get hard currency, and maybe map out the systems for a later attack, but not actively doing things. But in other cases, they're active attempts, and they could switch from one to the other at any time. So, just like having the system in place that has these capabilities tempts people to think of ways of doing it. It could be technical attacks, it could be social engineering attacks, but they have a target and they will keep on going. And so it was just last year that we saw that China had owned the CALEA system and thus had access to a tremendous amount of information. Possibly others had got in there previously, and we just weren't able to notice them. It's hard to prove the negative. But it shows you that like a major, well-funded, well-sophisticated threat actor was able to get in, and some of it is the convenience features that are placed with some of these backdoors. If they were replicating an old school system where they had to have somebody physically go to a wiring closet and attach wires to things, it doesn't scale very well, and if you're trying to compromise the system, you could bribe the person to do that, but you have to do this like over and over and over again. But if you just get access credentials to a system that is designed to be point and click convenient, you can do it at a much larger scale with much smaller compromise. So one of the challenges that are inherent in building these backdoors is it creates a less secure system. And I think that's essentially what the statement is. And I think a lot of the people who are trying to find are not saying this isn't a compromise. They're saying that there is some less security than not having the system, but like you can manage that compromise better. And the more absolutist position is just that the compromise in and of itself is eventually unmanageable. And in this case, it was 24 years after, 2024, so that was 30 years after CALEA passed when we found out that China was in the system, but that was what was being warned about back in 1994.
I would point out this is not the first CALEA-based hack. There was actually an incident in Greece where about 100 Greek officials had their phones effectively tapped, not because Greece has a law anything like CALEA, but just because the U.S. makes this law about how phone hardware has to work, and then that's how phone hardware gets manufactured. So Greece had phone hardware with CALEA-based stuff installed in it, which was vulnerable to the attack we're talking about.
I do want to ask who was at the panel this morning on Apple's advanced data protection. So a few of you, I just want to kind of dovetail off of what Kurt was saying in that this kind of system where you have mass. We brought this up, point out earlier in the day, so I didn't want to rehash that everyone had been there, but that you have the system where you build a backdoor, then that enables technical capacity for mass decryption of communication, mass surveillance, etc. Essentially. And if you have something like we have now, well, it's well in the context of earlier today, I was talking about the inability to, or the fact that there aren't encryption backdoors. There is this CALEA thing. But yeah, it's basically the fact that you have an exploits market that's singularly targeting individuals instead of this mass surveillance system for at least for encrypted communications.
All right. I think we have a question now.
Just a point of clarification, I'm 95% sure that the initial intrusion into the U.S. telecommunication carriers was not through a CALEA exploit or CALEA vulnerability. They just gained access to the systems, and then they were using the systems as designed because they had access to the administration. So you guys can talk about the vulnerabilities CALEA and the vulnerabilities all day long, but at the end of the day, they gained access to Cisco devices and network edge devices and other devices that had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that the CALEA system existed. It's just they had more keys to the kingdom once they got into the systems. I think that's really important.
To do with CALEA?
I'm sorry?
Having more keys once they're in the kingdom.
Well, I'm just saying that having access to CALEA is impactful, but it's not the reason why they gained access to the system. It's not how they gained access to the system in the first place. And I just wanted to make that point of clarification because I think it does have some implications to the rest of the conversation we're having.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. That is a that does impact things, but I think it is nevertheless important that you. So there's always the principle of least privilege in some sense, right? You want to make sure that when people gain access to something, they don't get the keys to the kingdom, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, you had network administrators of these telecommunication companies that had access to 600,000 subscribers at a time and did not have MFA tied to their network administration. So you're talking about really just leaving the door open for bad actors to come in.
I see your point, and we were pointing out some of the other ways it could be done. But as we were saying, like, it is a target that, because of this great access, and it was targeted, and as I say, you can also do it through social engineering, you can do it through a lot of different ways. What I guess the point I was trying to make is what is interesting about what CALEA has created is it creates that point of access that has all the keys for someone to try to get to, and you can get to in a variety of ways.
What was also a side interesting note is I think some of the victims of this intrusion actually were more upset that their political rivals could have access to some of their data than the foreign governments that actually was doing the hack. But
well, yeah, that's a different panel maybe.
Fair enough, but I think there would be all sorts of reasons why I would be upset about this data getting out.
But I think this brings up a point. I think it's going to come up several times this weekend, but I think this panel is probably one of the most appropriate for. We're talking about stuff here that is geopolitical in very real sense. And, we're talking about cyber warfare in some very real sense here. Our
That's a very limited term.
Well, okay, I'll avoid it then. But our cyber infrastructure affects all of our infrastructure. And is our cyber infrastructure actually ready for?
Luckily, we have a robust, cyber security and information security administration, CISA, currently, right? It's not at all been affected by the last year of geopolitics.
I don't want to get too much into this, but I will tell you that they are talking about giving out 60 grants for security research in the entire United States in the next year. 60, that's it.
Yeah.
That's at the beginning of the security pipeline, in some sense of like research to practice. At the end of the practice pipeline, we can point to any number of hacks of infrastructure things that have been done lately. Yeah, there are a lot of ways in which infrastructure that we don't necessarily think of as digital. So this would include phone infrastructure, but it also include power infrastructure, water infrastructure, might be vulnerable to various problems. Not all of these are induced by things like CALEA, some of them are induced by things like laziness.
And the internet, like, at the time wasn't built with security in mind. 20 years ago, you could go on an internet forum called Full Disclosure and just read some posts and perform exploits, and it was common. Now, the exploit market is a highly protected market where it's held close to the chest, and the systems in place now are just starting to harden. We're just starting to have widespread encryption, on the web, for instance. That was something that the browsers just switched the default to a couple of years ago, because of the work of EFF and doing HTTPS everywhere, and also Let's Encrypt, and since our inception I've been pushing, but it was kind of a Wild West situation for the longest time.
So let me ask this question. What should be done now, right? CALEA happened. We can't go back and undo that. We could change what the rules are now, but obviously that won't change things overnight, right? It will take time for things to adjust. And in the meantime, the infrastructure that we built today is still going to be there, still going to be used. So what should we do to help make sure that this doesn't keep happening?
Well, there's a we here, and the subject is important, right? Is we as citizens can use secure communication systems like Signal. We as advocates can kind of advocate for better legislative landscape in order to ensure that our communications aren't constantly under attack.
I would point out that contrary to some bad press earlier this year that was somewhat misleading, Signal is a very good encryption protocol, very good at keeping calls.
Just don't add the editor of a major magazine in the chat.
That's not an exploit technology can protect you from.
But I think, yes, there are things that we can do. I would say as well, like using multi-factor authentication, and also passkeys are available in some systems, and they're a lot easier to use than passwords. If you use a password, make it a complex one, 5 or 6 words, and because a lot of while 0 days and big exploits in the $1 million things, that is a thing, and that is hard to defend against. Most compromises are from phishing, getting someone to just hand you their password, from like low-level things, people not patching, people, the people in the loop, and improving your security with strong password, use encryption, use multi-factor passkeys when you can. When you use multi-factor, try to use an authenticator app or something other than a SMS phone message. And if these security steps were taken, that would sort of harden the landscape. So as people, harden yourselves, tell your friends to harden themselves, sometimes things will get through if someone is a really good at phishing. It's called spear phishing, where they research about you, and it is very hard to defend against. And that also means that people who are designing networks should make it so that even if somebody gets a password and into the system, that there's only so much that they can do. The privileges of each person are tailored to mean they don't get the run of the place. Response, you can contain it, so it's not just a perimeter defense. A lot of these measures need to come in together to solve these problems.
Subject of who is we, I mean, if I can imagine a much broader, if I had a magic techno fiat wand and could say how would phone policy work in the future, there's a bunch of stuff I would change. I would make caller ID so that it doesn't get spoofed. You have to actually have the key for that. It would probably cut down a lot of spam calls. We could make, in principle, phone calls end-to-end encrypted these days. The fact is we've got digital devices at the endpoints of just about every phone call. We could do a lot of things, but that would require magical control over all of the phone companies' policies.
And for what it's worth, on Salt Typhoon, which is the Chinese, a advisory came out today, a joint cybersecurity advisory from a fair number of different security agencies, various countries, countering Chinese state-sponsored actors compromising networks worldwide. And they have a 37-page advisory with lots of detail, which I have not read yet, but that I do appreciate that some people put together something and put it out in unclassified format for people who are in the network services business to hopefully be able to detect these attacks and take some countermeasures.
There's one aspect of this that we haven't talked about, which is the creation of a database of communications, a centralized node. And we know how much year after year, how many data breaches there are. We actually host a little contest, I would call it, called the Breachies at EFF. And the Breachies kind of detailed the worst data breaches in a year. And they're not small, they're getting larger. You see the AT&T data breach last year. It was in the order of millions. And you had major healthcare providers being breached every year. And so when you create a large database of information, then that becomes a salient target for a hack. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that if this data isn't collected in the first place, then it can be compromised and divulged on the dark web to a large number of actors that could threat.
All right, I think we want to leave plenty of time for questions. Before we turn it over, can we just very quickly go down the line and give one or what we think the biggest takeaway from this year's or last year's breaches are? Start with Bill and go down that way.
Well, so a lot of the breaches last year were due to a support software that was transferring files of major providers. It wasn't even that they were collecting the information. There was this pipeline whereby companies that collected information on their customers would use a file transfer a tool that would then the tool was compromised and a bunch of accounts were compromised because of that. So it's this kind of chain of the data going, not only being centralized in these different places, but even centralized from there into larger systems that could be compromised in the case of a high bidder.
Probably boil it down to government mandated backdoors are in general a terrible idea. And if you have to do them, there are precautions you could take, but we didn't.
Yeah, well, agreeing with my panelists, I'm no fan of backdoors. I would also say that for the compromises in general is that we collectively need to harden our security. And I think one of the things is the government is not has some people in it who are very smart about the issues, both in attacking things and offensive measures and for defensive measures. CISA did a lot of really good work for a while, but it needs to clean up the act there, because there's a lot of information being held about people within governments, and there are good reasons to have things highly protected there, and too many of those compromises, and also for commercial activity. So have good security, do red team testing, have your best people try to get access, and if you have a system, whether it's the government mandated system or CALEA, which has access to all communications, or you work on content moderation at a big tech company and you have access to all people's private DMs or what have you, if you have a system which is being used to respond to subpoenas, to do content moderation that has super privileged access. Realize that it's a target and harden it as best you can, and then test your hardening against people who are really good at getting into places.
And to dovetail off of that, if a compromise does happen after the fact that it happens, even if there's no mandatory reporting of it due to legislation, then let your customers know about it so that they can take mitigating steps due to the fact that their information has been compromised. Let them know about it so that they can make sure that their information, even if it's out there, they change their passwords, or they can actually protect themselves at that point.
I think my biggest takeaway, and this is often my biggest takeaway from these sorts of debacles, is that these sort of social policies, legal policies, have real impacts on technical policy, and those technical policies have real impact on what happens to data, what happens to users, what we experience in our day-to-day lives. And a lot of these are predictable, and we need good technologists in the room figuring out what it will look like to actually implement these policies as we go. And that's something that I won't say didn't happen with CALEA, because I know that there was a lot of that conversation happening with CALEA, but I'm not sure that it went the way I would have liked it to have gone.
One of the things, once upon a time, there was an office at Congress that was providing technical knowledge to Congress, sort of like the Congressional Research Service. And then it got cut in an era where they wanted to show that Congress was being frugal. But it's sorely missed. And I think that Congress is one of the major policy-making bodies, should have some nonpartisan, Congressional Research Service, which is legislative and legal analysis for them, do technical analysis, and provide that and answer questions for the representatives who often are not very sophisticated about technology or computers. Sometimes there's like a tech fellowship program, so sometimes people get help from that, and sometimes they will have people on their staff who are sophisticated. But, and how we all can help is, gracefully speak tech to power, is to help make sure that the policymakers are making policy, even if they come to a different conclusion than you might have. If they're doing it knowing the system and avoiding the obvious mistakes that everyone would agree with a mistake, right, that is still much better. You're going to have less bad policy and better good policy if they know the technology, where the traps are, what the problems are, where not really that big of a problem, and that requires good information to policymakers so they can make their decisions with good understanding.
All right, let's open it up to audience questions. Please, I think there's a microphone here in the middle. Please line up here. Please do try to make sure that your question ends with a question mark. I find it's very easy.
I have a question. As you just brought up about the policies and the policymakers as it comes to the security practices. So I have found that you have your technical team and you have your policy team. And there's a gap that exists, just like there is a weakest link with your user base and your technical staff. So how do you propose to bridge those gaps when it comes to the policy to create an ease of use while still staying secure so that you don't fall into these pitfalls of someone writing down a password or leaving a YubiKey behind because they don't understand the security behind it. They're just being told, hey, this is a security practice, do that. So how do you bridge those gaps?
Well, I guess one thing is make it so that having good security is easy. That most of the time when someone is told to do some security thing and they don't really fully understand why, it's a big pain in the ass, they will find a way to route around it. And so a lot of the gaps that happen within security from a corporate or government environment is that people find a way to not do the system. So, we referred a couple times to the Signalgate situation. There is a classified information communication systems that, the Secretary of Defense and friends could have used to talk about the Yemeni attacks. But it was easier to use Signal. And, to be fair, Signal is a strong end-to-end encryption thing, but you couldn't have added a non-governmental person randomly to the chat if you were using the classified information system. So the actual issue that happened there wouldn't have been possible on the system that was supposed to be used. But it wasn't easy enough to do, it wasn't convenient enough, so they routed around it. Usability in security, all software, but in security software in particular, is a key to security overall.
Yeah, one of the most important areas of research, I don't do research in, I think, is usable security. And it's a really, really hard field. But they are too often ignored.
I was just at the Usenix security conference, and there was a whole track on usable security, which had a bunch of really good research. I won't say it is not a solved field. People are constantly asking difficult questions in this area.
So there's the question of making it easier to use, to adopt, but how do you actually enforce that? Well, the way you enforce it is through regulatory bodies and through, in the case of Congress, you have this General Services Administration, GSA, which actually sets the standards for how Congress and congressional offices operate, right? So they can set standards by which, every single every single member of Congress must protect their website with HTTPS or whatever. And so those standards bodies can, for instance, say that, in order for a login to happen on the congressional websites, and you have to have multi-factor authentication, or that you can't leave sticky notes with your passwords on it, etc. So those kind of standards bodies have real power, to kind of enforce security standards within those offices.
All right, I think.
It's NIST for the executive branch. You said CSA for congressional, but NIST is the one for federal.
It's a GSA, the General Services.
Oh, General Services.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for someone like me who is often the one of, if not the only engineer for a small, poorly funded team who can't afford things like red teaming and stuff like that? I'm a decent engineer, but I'm not a security expert. So,
Phishing advice. Flyers with just phishing advice.
Yeah.
Like, just leave them around the office. It's a very cheap way to get some knowledge out there.
yeah.
I mean, start with the basics. Don't require that everybody have a password that's exactly 6 characters long with 2 special characters. You'd be surprised how many places do that still.
DoD also releases a whole series of one-sheets on how to protect yourself on all the different social media and setting your security protocols. So I would leave those around to say, hey, here's how you share with only friends and family on Facebook or other social media. And those DoD one-sheets are updated every 2 to 3 years, depending on who's doing it.
Have to willingly want to understand.
Well, they're one sheet, so yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, I don't have advice for clockwork oranging your staff.
Is CALEA, is that a uniquely American phenomena, or do other Western countries have similar laws?
Well, they definitely have similar laws. I can't speak to a lot of the details. CALEA itself is American, I believe.
Yes.
But, certainly the UK and Germany have similar laws.
Yeah, but in the UK, there is the Investigatory Powers Act that we were talking about at the morning session about Apple turning off advanced data protection in the UK. They had gotten a technical order under the Investigatory Powers Act requiring them to make their system accessible. And rather than backdoor their system, they chose to turn off the thing and tell people they turned it off, so that at least accessible, but it wasn't live.
I
It's
asked,
a really bad IPA, by the way.
I asked because I did not know if there was a similar vulnerability in the systems of other Western powers that China was seeking to exploit.
One thing that I think is worth pointing out is that not only do other countries have similar laws, but because the U.S. is such an important market in the Western world, a huge number of devices are built with CALEA built in, even if they're being sold to, I think somebody mentioned Greece earlier.
That's just a market factor. It's hard to, easier to make one version of things and then sell it to everybody, so. There's a lot of countries in this world, and most of them want to have lawful access to be easy. Many of them have proposed their own legislation about encryption and getting access to encrypted material. India was recently very aggressive about this, Brazil. Yeah, the exact same scenario and how it works here in particular, it might not be replicated, but thematically, it is commonplace for Western democracies to want to have lawful access, and also for authoritarian regimes to want to have, well, let's say access.
I'll say, on the international stage, we're talking, there's this yet to be implemented, but signed into law, the UN Cybercrimes Act. And the UN Cybercrimes Act is a UN treaty among UN Cybercrimes Treaty, right? It's a treaty amongst world powers to have greater collaboration when it comes to international crimes. But
it does much more than that.
And it compels, say, those that it compels countries that have the power to investigate a crime in one jurisdiction to actually comply with an order to do so in another jurisdiction. For instance, if there's a cyber crime that Russia is investigating, say they're investigating a gay group, because that's a crime in Russia, then they can send a mandate, and under the UN Cybercrime Treaty, there's very little mechanism for a country, say a Western democracy, to deny that request. So there's this collaborative mechanism in.
I mean, there are many problems with the UN Cybercrime Treaty. One of the things that they say is that like the Western powers could refuse to do it. But the problem would be so much that they would say this was like unlawful use of the internet, and they wouldn't say the unlawful use was saying something about being gay. Yeah. So it's a little bit like,
yeah, they don't
have a different set of problems, but it's still a very, sorry, I'm turning the mic so I can still hear you. It is still a very problematic bill, and I think you can like crystallize some of that in its background, which is there was the Budapest Cybercrime Treaty that Europe put together and many countries signed on to, and this is to replace that with a new one, and the leading people pushing for it are like Russia and China, and they want something that's going to give them more powers and more ability to investigate elsewhere. And when people tried to put in human rights provisions, they said, "Oh, those are not necessary. You don't need them here."
Next question.
The government signal scenario is interesting. And I think to those that don't work in the field a lot, they hear the term end-to-end encryption, and to them that means absolutely end-to-end, but really it's only end-to-end up to the decoding point. And if that endpoint device was compromised by a zero-click vulnerability, then it's just like they're looking over their shoulder. And to what extent is that an issue, especially your high-value target?
It's always an issue if a high-value target's phone is compromised. And we are a long way from having phones that can't have spyware on them.
Though, just to add to that, like this to say, one of the backdooring conversations going on with encrypted end-to-end encrypted messaging is client-side scanning. And so this, I think is more of a rhetorical trick because it comes to sort of the same result, but they do the interception by scanning messages at the endpoints and then send those on with the scanning algorithm. But then it's encrypted and goes to the other endpoint, which may also, scan it. So this is gets to some of the same issues as like on terms of privacy, but this is in the EU called chat control, and has been raised and re-raised over the last several years as a program to get greater surveillance of end-to-end encryption. without actually, like, but still allowing end-to-end encryption for part of it. They just scan it before and after. And this is going to be an interesting debate that's ongoing in Europe right now.
Just a quick follow-up on what you said earlier about like scale of markets and CALEA and all this stuff. Given the size of the China market and given the fact that they have the ability to kind of dictate some of these, forgive the uneducated question, but I mean, I travel Africa and various places. I mean, their phones are everywhere do they have public demands for any features like this, or what is their state of that?
Does anyone on the panel know about Chinese law?
Not enough to answer a question on Chinese law. I do know that because of the large market, some companies have been willing to modify their products to fit. Also, China does a lot of work to move people in their country over to Chinese versions of popular apps. So, like WeChat is the chat program you use in China, and I think everything on it is available to the Chinese government. And that affects people outside of China as well, because when people want to chat with somebody, like friends or relatives back in China, WeChat is the app that they use, and so it goes into that system.
And also just in general, like so there is a security researcher, Mona Wang, who in DEF CON last year presented on Chinese keyboard apps. The vast majority of Chinese users of Android use Chinese third-party keyboard apps, not the ones that are provided by Google, but like ones that are installed after, or that are come pre-installed on like Huawei devices, for instance, and are not like the Android built-in AOSP keyboard app. And it found that the cryptography was more like craptography. It was terrible and easily compromised and kind of homespun. And one of the principles anyone that has ever studied cryptography knows is that homespun crypto doesn't work, and it is very poor. And most of the apps that were, well, almost I think every one of the apps that now Citizen Lab studied was vulnerable to attacks that can be pretty easily compromised, just even from a third party viewing network traffic, compromise those communications.
Any programmers in the room, don't roll your own crypto. Using the crypto library correctly is hard enough. Don't try to roll your own crypto. You will get it wrong.
Rot 13, baby, let's go.
Anyone can make a crypto system that they themselves cannot break.
All right, I think with that, we have come to the end of the panel. Thank you very much for coming. Please remember to rate the panel and sign up, and to support our charity of the year, the what is it? It's NAMI, the something about mental illness. National
Alliance for Mental Illness.
National Alliance for Mental Illness. That's what it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.